The age-old question, where the heck do eels come from? While we may not know the exact answer to that, what we do know is that eels play a prominent role in cultures all around the world. Archaeologists find eel bones all the time from the Middle Ages in Germany and Northern Europe. At one point in England, you can even pay your rent in eels. That's how valuable they were. Grilled eel recipes were of course found in Japan as early as the 12th century. In one of the most famous paintings of all time, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, if you look closely, Jesus and his disciples have eels on the table. And even in North America, when the Pilgrims sailed over on the Mayflower for the very first time, historians say that one of the very first things that Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to do was catch eels. And later, those eels definitely showed up on the very first Thanksgiving dinner spread. Although eels somehow didn't make it through time to our modern Thanksgiving dinner table, eels were either a delicious delicacy or a cultural phenomenon across the world. Stories and theories about how eels came to be also became part of the culture, but no one knew where they came from. What's stranger still is that eels were seemingly found everywhere. Rivers, lakes, the sea, brooks, ponds, everywhere. Even in ponds that dried up and refilled every year with no access to other bodies of water. And on top of that, they seemingly had no sexual organs and nobody has ever seen an eel mate to this day. Aristotle postulated that since eels don't seem to have any reproductive organs, they must appear spontaneously from rain and mud water. Pliny the Elder went for a budding theory. He thought new eels developed when old eels would rub themselves against rocks. My favorite and most out there theory comes from the English countryside, where they believed eels came from the hair of a horse's tail falling in the water. And even the great science minds of the time were also wrong in their theories. The great Carl Linnaeus, who was, amongst many other things, a zoologist and considered the father of taxonomy, believed that eels gave birth to live young. The only problem is, the eel that he thought gave birth to live young wasn't an eel at all, but a fish called an eel pout. At one point in the 18th century, Italian scientists decided to band together amidst the many wars that Italy was going through at the time and wanted to bolster up unity and strength for the nation by being the first country to discover an eel's gonads. A certainly unique way of politicking. So everyday eels were caught in the Po River Delta, dissected, and rummaged through to find these elusive gonads. One day, an Italian surgeon did just that. He caught a particularly plump eel who he thought was possibly pregnant. And when he opened up this eel, he found what he thought were ovaries and eggs. An esteemed physician and naturalist, Antonio Vallisneri, was so excited that he hastily announced that they had officially found the gonads of an eel. But they were wrong. Then almost 50 years later, in 1777, another esteemed naturalist, Carlo Mondini, opened up another particularly plump eel. And when he dissected this eel, he noticed frills along the side of the eel and realized, oh, those are the ovaries. But testes were still on the loose. Before Sigmund Freud was known for his sex psychology, he was absolutely obsessed with finding the testes of an eel. Eventually, Freud moved on to humans, where testes were not so much of a mystery. But why was it so hard to find the eel's sex organs? Years of this question prompted scientists to slow down and investigate the eel anatomy as well as their life cycle. Giovanni Grassi, an Italian naturalist, found this tiny sliver of a thing, translucent with bulbous black eyes, and realized that this is potentially the larva of an eel. To confirm his theory, Grassi counted the vertebrae of this larva and compared it to a European freshwater eel. And it was a match. Now we're finally onto something. Eels are interesting in that they have 4 different phases to their life cycle, which often got them mistaken for 4 different types of fish, when in fact it was the same eel the entire time. The eel starts out as that translucent or glass eel larva out in the open ocean heading towards Europe. Then the eel becomes a shimmery looking glass eel called an elver, where it makes its way up the coast of Europe. Then it becomes this yellow-brown eel found in ponds. At this phase, the eel can move from the pond to mud and hibernate for half a century if it wants to. And finally, the last phase, a silver eel. Now the eel is grown with powerful muscles that will take it back to the strong ocean currents, where it will travel for thousands of miles, relying only on its fat reserves to survive. The eel's stomach dissolves in the process, and the reproductive organs develop for the first time. Which is why when Europeans tried to find the sexual organs of an eel from European ponds and could not, it was because the reproductive organs didn't exist yet. But that answers only part of the question. The bigger question still remains: where the heck do eels come from? If you like this video and learned anything at all, go ahead and hit the like button and just subscribe while you're at it, because why not? In the late 1800s, Danish oceanographer Johan Schmidt decided that he needed to know once and for all. So he mapped out the ocean, searching for eel larvae. His game plan was to follow the eels to the open ocean and hopefully find their original source. This was a behemoth task to try to track down eel larvae. As we said earlier, the eel larvae are these 3 inches of translucent, wiggly flesh, that too in the entire Atlantic Ocean. And for this reason, Schmidt was described as pathologically ambitious. Fortunately for him, he was able to fund this long and complex expedition because he just got married to the heiress of the Carl Jarlsberg brewery. Johann Schmidt got married, and then he went on a boat and sailed away for 19 years. Although he was away for 19 years, he did find what he was searching for. Schmidt scanned the ocean with finer and finer nets until he progressively found tinier and tinier larvae, until eventually he tracked them down to their original source. And in 1921, Johann Schmidt shared his findings that he tracked the eels down to an area in the West Atlantic called the Sargasso Sea. Which is right in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. The Sargasso Sea is interesting in that its borders are not land, but different ocean currents. The water in the Sargasso Sea is incredibly salty and deep, but what's more interesting is that there are several genetically distinct species of eels that breed in the Sargasso Sea, including the American eel. And so even with all those larvae mixed up, the American eel knows exactly which postcode and which continent to swim to. Other scientists and other expeditions were done with newer technology. One expedition collected 7,000 different types of fish in the Sargasso Sea, and not one single fish was an eel larva. With that being said, no one to this day has ever seen a live or dead eel in the Sargasso Sea, only the larvae. Scientists then decided to put GPS trackers on 700 silver eels to see if these eels would lead them to their breeding ground. Every single eel somehow disappeared. Perhaps some died, or some were eaten, or the GPS tracker fell off. We don't know. But not a single eel was tracked successfully. The only data recovered before the GPS got lost was from one single eel. The GPS tracked the eel from where the eel started in St. Lawrence, Canada, and then from there, the eel went east up towards Scotland, and then reversed back to Maine. And then from Maine, it made a beeline south directly towards the Sargasso Sea. But right before it hit the Sargasso Sea, that's when the GPS got lost. Another American scientist tried to breed 100 male and female eels in captivity and then bring them out to the Sargasso Sea. But during the trip over, 95 of the females died, and when they put the remaining 5 eels in these underwater cages, all 5 of them disappeared and were never found again. As of this video in 2022, not a single person has successfully tracked a single eel to the Sargasso Sea. Going back to the yellow-brown phase of the eel life cycle, no one really understands what causes the yellow eel to break their hibernation or come out of their hibernation and go to the sea to become a silver eel. And there are eels that can be in the same silver eel phase that are swimming together in the ocean, but are decades apart in age. The concept of time for an eel is also a big question mark. Well, this video just opened up a whole can of worms, or should I say a whole can of eels. If you like this content but want more of it, you can subscribe to my socials linked below. If you want to hear this in an audio version only, I also have a podcast called The Deadly Dose, so go ahead and subscribe to that as well for weekly science content. But until then, I will see you in my next video.